Before the Jedi Order existed, before the Sith had a home world, before the Galactic Republic was even a concept, something terrible was already out there. And what we are about to walk through is the story of the species that held the entire galaxy in chains for 10,000 years. Quickly, before we get going, be sure to drop a like and hype if you are enjoying. Now, we are talking about a time so far before the Battle of Yavin that most Star Wars fans have never even heard of it. Deep in a stretch of space called the Unknown Regions, on a temperate world called Lehon, there lived a species called the Rakata. Some called them the Builders, and they would go on to create the largest empire the galaxy had ever seen. But before any of that happened, they were just another primitive species on a planet that nobody in the wider galaxy knew about. The Rakata looked like nothing else in the Star Wars universe. They were humanoid in shape, but they were bigger than humans. Their heads were bulbous and cone-shaped. They had two deep-set eyes and wide mouths that stretched across their faces. Their skin was gray or reddish-gray for most of the population, though there were extremely rare subbreeds that looked different. The Buksek had black skin, the Ikalik had crimson stripes, and the Drut were pale blue. Females had more slender builds and actually had hair, which was something the males did not have at all. They stood out in every way. But the thing that made the Rakata truly different from almost every other species in the galaxy was that all of them were naturally force-sensitive. The entire species. Every single one of them could touch the Force from the moment they were born. That sounds like a gift, and it was. But that gift would eventually become the thing that destroyed them. Now here is where the story of the Rakata takes a turn that most people do not expect. Because the Rakata did not figure out the Force on their own. They had teachers, and those teachers came from very far away. A species called the Kwa arrived on Lehon many years before 36,453 BBY, which is the earliest fixed date we have in this entire timeline. The Kwa were a force-sensitive reptilian species from the planet Dathomir, and they had technology that was beyond anything the Rakata had ever seen. The Kwa possessed something called Infinity Gate technology, which allowed them to travel instantly from one end of the galaxy to the other. No hyperspace lanes, no light speed calculations. Just step through a gate and you are on the other side of the galaxy. The Kwa were not conquerors, though. They were the opposite. They had made it their mission to travel from world to world, finding primitive species, teaching them about the Force, and sharing advanced technology. They served the Celestials, who were the dominant galactic power at that time. The Celestials had other species working under them too, like the Gree and the Killiks, but the Kwa were among the most active when it came to reaching out to new worlds, and when they found the Rakata on Lehon, they decided to help them. They became the Rakata's benefactors. They lifted them out of their primitive state. They taught them about the Force and gave them access to technology that the Rakata could never have developed on their own. Around this same period, the Celestials also folded the Rakata into their Galactic Order as one of their slave races. So, the Rakata were learning from the Kwa and serving the Celestials at the same time. And for a while, that arrangement seemed to work. But the Kwa had made a terrible mistake because they did not fully understand what they were dealing with. The Rakata were, at their core, a cruel and violent species. This was not something that developed over time. It was not the result of outside influence. It was baked into their culture from the very beginning. The Rakata consumed the remains of their enemies. They consumed their own kind. This was normal behavior for them. It was part of who they were as a species. And when the Kwa started teaching them about the Force, the Rakata did not embrace balance. They did not pursue both sides of the Force the way the Kwa intended. They went straight to the dark side, and they never looked back. The Kwa watched in horror as the species they had uplifted twisted every lesson and every piece of technology they had been given into something aggressive. The Rakata paired the dark side of the Force with the advanced technology the Kwa had shared, and they started expanding outward from Lehon. They began conquering other worlds in the unknown regions, taking everything they could get their hands on. And then the Rakata turned their attention to the one thing the Kwa had not given them: the Infinity Gates. The Rakata demanded access to the gates, and the reason they wanted them was obvious. The Infinity Gates were not just transportation devices. They were also capable of unleashing devastating energy attacks. In the hands of the Rakata, that technology would have been a weapon on a scale the galaxy had never experienced. The Kwa looked at what the Rakata had already become, and they said no. That refusal started a war, and this was not a small conflict. On Lehon itself, many Kwa lost their lives in a desperate battle against the very species they had tried to help. But the Kwa were not fighting to win. They were fighting to buy time, because their real goal was to make sure the Infinity Gate on Lehon was destroyed before the Rakata could take control of it. And they succeeded. The gate on Lehon was gone, but the Kwa did not stop there. They traveled from planet to planet, systematically destroying or sealing every Infinity Gate they could reach across the galaxy. They posted enormous guardian creatures called woofer worms to protect whatever star temples still remained. The Kwa did everything they could to make sure the Rakata would never get their hands on that technology. But the cost was everything. The Kwa civilization never recovered from the war. Over the generations that followed, they degenerated. On Dathomir, the species that had once traveled the galaxy through gateways of pure energy slowly devolved into simple creatures called the Qui. They lost their intelligence. They lost their technology. They lost everything that had made them who they were. The species that had come to Lehon as teachers and benefactors ended up being consumed by the very students they had tried to help. The Rakata took what the Kwa had given them, turned it into something dark, and then they turned on the Kwa themselves. And this was just the beginning, because now the Rakata had a taste for conquest. They had the dark side of the Force running through every member of their species. They had advanced technology that they had stolen and twisted for their own purposes. And they were looking outward at a galaxy full of worlds that had no idea what was coming for them. The Rakata had already torn apart the species that gave them everything. But the Kwa were not the biggest power in the galaxy, not even close. And now the Rakata were about to go after the one civilization that had ruled over everything for longer than anyone could remember. The Celestials had been the dominant force in the galaxy for over 100,000 years. We talked about them in our Mortis Gods video if you want the full story on who they were. But what matters here is that the Celestials were not just powerful. They were the power. They had shaped the physical structure of the galaxy itself. They had controlled entire civilizations. They had seeded species across star systems and built constructs on a scale that no one could replicate. The Gree served them. The Kwa served them. The Kilix served them. And the Rakata had been folded into that same order as one of their prisoner races. But the Rakata were done being servants. They looked at the Celestials, the beings who had controlled the galaxy since before recorded history, and they decided that the old gods had to go. Pre-Republic specialists who studied this era later pieced together what happened. Dr. Innsmouth Bowen of the O'Brien Institute for Archaeology was one of the leading voices on the subject, and the general conclusion among researchers like him was straightforward. The Rakata revolted against the Celestials and fought to wipe them out entirely. This was not a bid for independence. This was not a species trying to break free and go their own way. The Rakata wanted the Celestials gone from the galaxy, and the ancient records that survived from this period paint a picture of just how far the Rakata were willing to go to make that happen. The Gree Enclave, one of the oldest surviving civilizations in the galaxy, kept ancient texts called grimoires that recorded fragments of this war. And the Gree had their own name for the Rakata. They called them the Soul Hunters. According to these grimoires, the Soul Hunters unleashed two curses on the Celestials. The Gree referred to these as the Grey Swallowing and the Faceless Mouths. They also described them as the Hollowers of Beings and the Eaters of Worlds. Now we do not know exactly what those names referred to in a literal sense, whether they were weapons, plagues, rituals, or something else entirely. But the Gree chose those words carefully, and whatever the Rakata unleashed on the Celestials, it was devastating enough that an entirely separate civilization recorded it in their most sacred texts thousands of years later. The Rakata were not just going after the Celestials either. They were systematically targeting every species that had served alongside them under celestial rule. The Kwa were already in decline after the war on Lehon and the destruction of their infinity gates. The Rakata continued to wage war against them, pushing them further toward extinction. The Gree were hit hard as well, attacked by a species that saw them as competition that needed to be removed. And the Killiks, an ancient insectoid species that had served as laborers for the Celestials for tens of thousands of years, simply vanished during this period. They were just gone. Whether the Rakata drove them out, whether they fled, or whether something else happened to them entirely, the result was the same. Every major species that had been part of the Celestial Order was either destroyed, scattered, or erased during this era. The Rakata were clearing the board. They did not want rivals. They did not want neighbors. They wanted to be the only power left standing. And through all of this, there is one theory that shows just how desperate the situation became for the Celestials. Some researchers later speculated that the hyperspace turbulence that sits west of the deep core, the same turbulence that would prevent the Republic from exploring the unknown regions for thousands of years, was actually created by the Celestials themselves. A last effort to hold back the Rakata. A wall built out of hyperspace itself, designed to slow down a species that could not be stopped any other way. Whether that theory is true or not, it tells you something about the scale of what the Rakata were doing. The most powerful beings the galaxy had ever known were apparently trying to build barriers just to buy themselves more time. It did not work. By 33,600 BBY, the Celestials had vanished from the galaxy entirely. Gone. A civilization that had existed for over 100,000 years, that had built star systems, that had commanded the Force on a level nobody else could even comprehend, was no longer there. Dr. Bowen speculated on what might have happened to them. Maybe the Rakata succeeded in wiping them out completely. Maybe they escaped through their own hyperspace barrier into some region of space the Rakata could not follow. Maybe they withdrew from this dimension altogether. Thousands of years later, The Sith Lord Darth Plagueis would offer his own idea, suggesting that the Celestials may have merged into the Force itself to guide its path going forward. Nobody knows for certain, but the outcome was clear. The Celestials were gone, and the galaxy belonged to the Rakata. With no rival civilization left to challenge them in any corner of the galaxy, the Rakata did what every conqueror does when the competition disappears. They declared themselves an empire. A Rakata who styled himself the Darita, which meant emperor, formally founded what they called the Infinite Empire. And the name was not an exaggeration. By 35,000 BBY, the Rakata had spread out from the unknown regions and pushed into the Eastern Galaxy, conquering hundreds of worlds along the way. They used stolen Qua technology and the dark side of the Force to fuel every step of that expansion. Everything they had taken, everything they had twisted for their own purposes, was now being used to build something the galaxy had never seen before. Their key advantage was a piece of technology that changed everything about how they moved through space. The Rakata had developed a Force-powered hyperdrive. This was completely different from the hyperdrives that would come later in galactic history. The Rakatan drive could only lock onto worlds that had significant Force signatures, which meant planets with high concentrations of life. If a world was teeming with living things, the Rakata could find it and travel to it. If it was barren or empty, their drives could not reach it. This created an empire that was enormous in scope, but uneven in coverage. There were massive gaps between their conquered worlds where the Rakata could not go. And in those gaps, without the Rakata even realizing it, other civilizations were quietly developing on their own, using dangerous and unreliable hyperdrive technology that had nothing to do with the Force. But the worlds that the Rakata could reach had a very different experience. Because the Rakata were not just showing up and planting a flag. They needed the populations on those worlds. Their entire civilization ran on the Force, and they had figured out a way to turn living beings into fuel. The Rakata developed technology that could induce fear and hatred in Force-sensitive beings. They would place these terrified people into machines that converted their dark side emotions into raw energy. That energy powered Rakatan warships. It powered their factories. It powered their entire way of life. The suffering of other species was literally the engine that kept the Infinite Empire running. And the way they treated those prisoners tells you everything you need to know about what kind of empire this was. Every prisoner was stripped of their identity. They were assigned a letter from the Arabesh alphabet, and that letter was tattooed across their bodies, on their faces, on their backs, on their arms, even on limbs that could be separated from their body, so that no matter what happened to a prisoner, they could always be identified and tracked. A prisoner was not a person to the Rakata. A prisoner was a resource, a battery, a piece of equipment that happened to be alive. And if a prisoner did something that displeased their Rakatan master, the punishment was the same as it had always been for the Rakata. The prisoner was consumed. That was the foundation of the Infinite Empire. An entire galactic civilization built on fear, on the dark side, and on the suffering of every living thing the Rakata could get their hands on. And they were just getting started. By 30,000 BBY, the Infinite Empire had become the single largest civilization the galaxy had ever seen. And nothing that came after it, not the Republic, not the Galactic Empire, none of it would ever match the scale of what the Rakata built during this period. At its peak, The Infinite Empire linked over 500 Force-rich worlds spread across the galaxy, from the unknown regions all the way to what would later become the core worlds. The Rakata had their grip on everything. The numbers alone are hard to wrap your head around. Approximately 10 billion Rakatan warriors made up the military backbone of the empire, and the captive population across all of their territories exceeded 1 trillion beings. 1 trillion. That is a number so large it almost stops meaning anything. But every single one of those beings was a real person, from a real world, living under Rakatan control. And the worlds they conquered were not random backwater planets on the fringes of the galaxy. The Rakata had taken some of the most important worlds in all of Star Wars. Coruscant, the future capital of the Galactic Republic and the Galactic Empire, home of the human species. Corellia, one of the most famous shipbuilding worlds in galactic history. Kashyyyk, homeworld of the Wookiees. Manaan, where the Selkath lived. Dantooine. Honoghr, the Noghri homeworld. And Tatooine. Every one of those names carries weight for Star Wars fans. And every one of those worlds was under the boot of the Rakata, thousands of years before any of the stories we know took place on them. The species that fell under Rakatan rule included humans, Wookiees, Selkath, Duros, Nikto, Hutts, Noghri, and dozens more. It did not matter how strong your species was. It did not matter how old your civilization was. It did not matter how many systems you controlled. If the Rakata showed up at your world, you were now part of their empire. Every non-Rakata species was considered lesser, every single one. The Rakata saw themselves as the only beings in the galaxy that mattered, and everyone else existed to serve them. Now, some of the things the Rakata did to these conquered worlds go beyond anything we see in the rest of Star Wars. And one of the most dramatic examples is Tatooine. Most fans know Tatooine as a desert. 2 suns, endless sand, moisture farmers trying to scrape by on a planet that does not seem to want anyone living on it. That is the Tatooine Luke Skywalker grew up on. But Tatooine was not always like that. Before the Rakata arrived, Tatooine was a lush jungle world. It had flowing water, it had green terrain, it was home to a species called the Kumumga. And then the Rakata turned the surface of the planet to glass through orbital bombardment. They fired down from space with enough force to vitrify the entire surface. The jungles were gone. The water was gone. Everything that had made Tatooine a living world was stripped away and replaced with the endless desert that we see in the films. The Rakata did that. Every grain of sand on that planet is a reminder of what they were capable of. Kashyyyk is another example, and this one played out in a completely different way. The Rakata installed a terraforming computer on the planet that was designed to manipulate the Rosha trees, the massive trees that the Wookiees are famous for living in. In 33,598 BBY, that computer lost contact with the Rakata, and about 2 centuries after that, it malfunctioned. The malfunction caused the growth of the Roshia trees to accelerate at a rate that was never intended. The trees grew taller and taller, layer after layer, until they became the towering multi-layered forests that define Kashyyyk in every piece of Star Wars media. The entire ecosystem that the Wookiees would build their civilization around, the multiple levels of the forest, the canopy that reaches so high it blocks out the sky, All of that exists because a piece of Rakatan technology broke. The Wookiees built their entire way of life on top of a malfunction, and it was not just about reshaping planets. The Rakata also stripped worlds completely bare of their natural resources. Duro and Morcia were gutted. Everything of value was taken. On Coruscant and Corellia, the populations that lived there were forced to construct weapons on a massive scale for their Rakatan overlords. The people of those worlds were not just living under Rakatan control. They were being used to build the very tools that would keep the rest of the galaxy under that same control. The Rakata may have also displaced the Kilix from Alderaan and the Sharu from the Rafa system during this period, further clearing the galaxy of any species that might one day challenge them. Now there is one more part of the Rakatan system that we need to talk about because it becomes critical later in this story. When a captive who was particularly strong in the Force was discovered by a Rakatan Predor, which was their term for a military lord, that Predor had the option to train them as something called a Force Hound. Force Hounds were powerful dark side users, but they were not warriors in the traditional sense. Their purpose was very specific. They were trained to sense planets with strong Force signatures and to locate the inhabitants on those worlds for their masters. They were trackers, scouts. The Rakata used them to find the next target, the next world full of life that the Infinite Empire could reach with their Force-powered hyperdrives. Force Hounds were branded with Arabesh letters on their faces, their backs, and their arms. Those brands were permanent. There was no hiding what you were or who you belonged to, and the lives they lived were defined by constant violence. Predors would pit their Force Hounds against each other in fights to entertain themselves. A Force Hound knew nothing outside of the Rakatan way of life. They were raised in it. They were trained in it. They lived and fought inside a system that treated them as tools with an expiration date. The only culture they ever experienced was the culture of the beings who had taken them. And that system, as terrible as it was, would prove to be one of the most important elements of this entire story when we reach the final years of the Infinite Empire. Because two Force Hounds in particular, a figure named Zesh and another named Trill, would end up at the center of the war between the Rakata and the Jedi Order on the planet Tython. Their stories would change the course of the conflict and play a direct role in one of the most important battles the Infinite Empire ever fought. But that comes later. For now, what you need to understand is the scale of what the galaxy was dealing with around 30,000 BBY. 500 worlds under Rakatan control. 1 trillion beings held captive across those worlds. Entire planets reshaped or destroyed to serve the needs of one species. And a military machine fueled by the fear and suffering of every living thing the Rakata could reach. The Infinite Empire was not just the biggest empire of its time. It was the biggest empire the galaxy would ever see, and the beings at the top of it genuinely believed it would last forever. That is what infinite meant to them. They thought this would never end. They were wrong. Running an empire that stretched across 500 worlds required resources on a level that most civilizations could not even begin to calculate. Warships needed to be built. War droids needed to be assembled. Military hardware needed to roll off production lines at a pace that matched the Rakata's appetite for expansion. And by 30,000 BBY, the demand had outgrown everything the Infinite Empire could produce through conventional means. So the Rakata built something new, something that would become their greatest achievement and eventually the thing that tore them apart from the inside. They called it the Star Forge, and there was nothing else like it in the history of the galaxy. The Star Forge was constructed over the star Abo in the Lahon system, right in the backyard of the Rakatan homeworld. It was a space station, but calling it that does not come close to capturing what it actually was. This thing was 65 kilometers tall. 3 massive fins extended downward from its main body, reaching toward the star below, and the gaps between those fins were wide enough for capital ships to fly through without issue. The Star Forge drew energy and raw matter directly from the star beneath it and combined that material with the power of the Force. The result was a factory that could produce a functionally endless supply of warships, war droids, and military equipment. One station, that is all it took. The Star Forge alone could meet the entire Infinite Empire's demand for starship and war droid construction. Everything the Rakata needed to keep their military machine running came from this single construct hanging above a star. The construction of the Star Forge was carried out through forced labor. The Rakata pulled workers from dozens of subject worlds to build it. Populations from Belsavis, Corellia, Coruscant, Dantooine, Kashyyyk, Manaan, Malastar, and Tatooine were all brought in for the project. Thousands upon thousands of beings from across the galaxy forced to construct a weapon that would be used to keep their own worlds under Rakatan control. And when the work was finished, when the last piece was in place and the Star Forge was operational, the Rakata did exactly what you would expect them to do. Every single person who had been brought in to build the station was put down. All of them. The Rakata left no witnesses. Nobody who had worked on the Star Forge was allowed to walk away with knowledge of its secrets. The station was too important, too powerful, and the Rakata were not going to risk anyone carrying information about it back to the wider galaxy. But here is where the story of the Star Forge goes from impressive to terrifying. Because the Star Forge was not just a machine. It was partially powered by the dark side of the Force, and that made it something far more dangerous than a simple factory. The Rakatan scientists and engineers who designed it understood that they were giving this station access to nearly limitless supplies of energy. They believed they could handle it. They believed they could control what they had built. And they were completely wrong. The Star Forge was a semi-living entity. It was aware in a way that no piece of technology should be. And it was hungry. Over time, the station began to gorge on dark side energies, pulling more and more of that power into itself. It started feeding off the very species that had created it. The Rakata were naturally aggressive. They were naturally drawn to cruelty and dominance. Those traits had defined them since before the Kwa ever arrived on Lahon. And the Star Forge latched onto all of it. It amplified every dark impulse the Rakata already had. Their paranoia got worse. Their violent tendencies intensified. Their ability to work together and maintain order within their own empire started breaking down. And the worst part was the feedback loop. The Rakata's dark side traits fed energy into the Star Forge. The Star Forge took that energy and used it to amplify those same traits in the Rakata. The Rakata then produced even more dark side energy, which fed back into the Star Forge again. Around and around it went, getting worse with every cycle. The station was making its creators more dangerous, more unstable, and more self-destructive with every passing generation. And the Rakata had no idea it was happening. They thought the Star Forge was serving them. In reality, they were serving it. The Star Forge would end up being more responsible for the fall of the Infinite Empire than any outside threat, any plague, or any uprising from their captive populations. The thing that made them unstoppable was quietly eating them alive. Now the Star Forge was the crown jewel of Rakatan technology, but it was far from the only thing they built. The Rakata created an entire catalog of technological achievements during this era, and some of them are still showing up in Star Wars stories set 20,000 years later. That is how advanced this civilization was. They built things that outlasted them by millennia. One of the most widespread were the star maps. These were self-sustaining, self-repairing monuments that the Rakata placed on their conquered worlds. Each star map displayed the full extent of the infinite empire with Lihon at the center. They were navigational tools and symbols of dominance at the same time. And because they were designed to maintain and repair themselves, many of them were still functional tens of thousands of years after the empire that built them had crumbled to nothing. They also built terraforming machines, which we already saw the effects of on Kashyyyk and Tatooine. But those were just two examples. The Rakata used this technology across dozens of worlds, completely reshaping the climate, the geology, the plant life, and the animal life of entire planets to match whatever the Rakata needed from them. If a world did not suit their purposes in its natural state, they just changed it. Then there were the mind traps. These were some of the most disturbing devices in the entire Rakatan arsenal. A mind trap could pull a person's consciousness out of their body and lock it inside a virtual space, a kind of white room with no exit. The body stayed intact. The person was still technically alive, but their mind was gone, trapped inside this device, potentially for eternity. You could be sitting in a mind trap for 10,000 years and have no way out. Your body would be there. Your mind would be somewhere else entirely, and there was nothing you could do about it. The Rakata also deployed disruptor fields on a planetary and system-wide scale. These fields could shut down enemy technology completely. Any ship that entered a system protected by a disruptor field would lose its communications and its navigation. You could not call for help. You could not plot a course out. You were stuck, flying through hostile space with no instruments, no way to contact anyone, and no way to know where you were going. It was one of the most effective defensive systems in the galaxy, and the Rakata used it to protect their most important holdings. Their fleet relied on what were called skip ships, force-powered vessels that could hop from one force-rich world to the next. And while those ships had limitations that we already covered, they gave the Rakata the ability to move across the galaxy in a way that no other species at the time could match. The Rakata were also rumored to be among the first species in the galaxy to develop energy shield technology, which would eventually become standard across every major civilization that came after them. And then there were the builder droids, advanced war droids armed with plasma cannons that could break apart matter at the atomic level. These were not the clunky battle droids you see in the Clone Wars. These were weapons platforms designed by a civilization that had been building machines of war for thousands of years, armed with technology that could take apart anything they pointed at. Every piece of this technology served the same purpose: control. The Star Forge produced the fleet. The disruptor fields protected the territory. The Force Hounds found new targets. The mind traps dealt with anyone who resisted. And the star maps made sure the entire empire knew exactly where every world in their domain was located. It was a system designed to run forever, and for a long time it looked like it would. But the Star Forge was already doing its work in the background, slowly pulling the Rakata apart from the inside. And the galaxy that the Rakata had spent thousands of years conquering was about to start pushing back in ways they never expected. The Rakata conquered worlds. They stripped planets bare. They bent entire species to their will. But there were some things in the galaxy that even the Infinite Empire could not control. Things too dangerous to use and too powerful to destroy. So the Rakata did the only thing they could. They built a prison. The planet they chose was Belsavis, a jungle world with tropical rifts that cut through an otherwise frozen surface. And the Rakata converted the entire planet into a containment facility on a scale that defies belief. They used stasis technology to entomb the most dangerous things in the galaxy beneath the surface of this world. Monsters that no Rakatan text could fully describe. Heretics and warlords from within their own ranks who had become too dangerous to leave free. Weapons that were capable of shattering stars, and in some cases, entire species. Anything the Rakata feared, anything they could not afford to let loose, anything they treasured above all reason, it went into the vaults on Belsavis. And the Rakata planned for the long term. They left behind automated droids whose only job was to maintain the seals on those vaults. Those droids kept running for over 20,000 years after the Infinite Empire fell. 20,000 years of silent maintenance on a planet that the rest of the galaxy eventually forgot about. And when the Republic finally discovered Belsavis thousands of years later, they found the tropical rifts, noticed that something about this planet did not match the ice age covering the rest of its surface, and they built their own prison right on top of the Rakatan vaults. The Republic had no idea what was sitting underneath them. They were building cells on top of cells, completely unaware that the ground beneath their feet was holding back things that made their worst inmates look harmless. Now the reason Belsavis was built in the first place, the very first prisoner that the Rakata needed to contain, was something called the World Razor. And this is where the story goes to a level that is hard to even process. The World Razor was an ancient Force-sensitive entity whose hunger had supposedly consumed 1,000 worlds. Not conquered, consumed. This thing fed on planets the way a fire feeds on wood. And according to Rakatan inscriptions found inside the tomb on Belsavis, it took the combined might of the entire Infinite Empire to bring the World Razor down. Every resource they had, every weapon, every warrior, all of it focused on subduing a single entity. And even then, they could not finish it off. They could only contain it. The inscriptions warned that if the World Razor were ever set free, its fury could shatter the galaxy itself. So the Rakata locked it beneath the surface of Belsavis and built an entire planetary prison around it to make sure it stayed there. That warning almost came true about 20,000 years later. During the Galactic War around 3641 BBY, the Sith Empire launched an assault on Belsavis that accidentally cracked open some of the ancient Rakatan stasis vaults. And one of the species that came spilling out, the Eshkar, immediately tried to free the World Razor. A Republic strike team managed to stop them just in time. They activated a failsafe called the Burning Way, which dropped molten liquid directly onto the creature's cell, and they sealed the entity back inside. The galaxy came that close to losing everything because someone opened a door they did not understand. The Eshkar themselves have a story worth telling. At some point during the height of the Infinite Empire, the Eshkar species began overrunning a number of Rakatan subject worlds. They were raiding settlements and tearing through populations at a pace that actually got the Rakata's attention. And that is saying something, because the Rakata did not worry about much. But the Eshkar were different. The Rakata considered them a plague on the galaxy and pulled together their military forces to deal with the threat. During this conflict, an Eshkar named Hollow Voice came forward and appealed to the Rakata directly. He asked them to spare his species. He tried to negotiate peace, and the Rakata appeared to listen. They strung the talks out, acting like they were genuinely considering his offer. But the entire negotiation was a stall. The Rakata were using the time to fully surround and contain the Eshkar forces. Once the trap was set, they captured Hollow Voice and ended any pretense of diplomacy. The war that followed swept across the galaxy and nearly wiped the Eshkar from existence. When it was over, only about 100,000 of them were left alive. Every single survivor was sent to Belsavis. The Rakata locked them inside stasis vaults, the same technology they used for the World Razor and their other most dangerous prisoners. But the stasis the Eshkar experienced had a specific cruelty built into it. The technology preserved their bodies perfectly, but it left them conscious. They were aware the entire time. They could not move. They could not speak. They could not interact with anything around them. But they were awake. The Rakata designed it that way on purpose. They believed that being trapped in eternal waking imprisonment would teach the Eshkar the error of their ways. That was the Rakatan idea of justice. Not just locking someone away, but making sure they felt every second of it for the rest of time. And the Eshkar were not the only ones from the Rakatan side of things who ended up in those vaults. A Rakatan warlord named Soa, known as the Infernal One, had been one of the rulers of the Infinite Empire. Soa had carved out his own sub-empire with Korriban as his throne world. He had become powerful enough and dangerous enough that the Infinite Empire itself decided he needed to be removed. They imprisoned Soa on Belsavis in a section that would later be called the Eternity Vault. And when that vault was eventually breached during the Old Republic era, Soa proved to be one of the most dangerous things inside the entire prison complex. It took serious firepower to put him back down. That is what Belsavis was. A planet where the Rakata stored everything they were afraid of. Creatures that could eat worlds. Species that had nearly overrun their empire. Warlords from their own ranks who had gotten too powerful. Weapons that could break stars apart. All of it locked away beneath the surface of a single world, watched over by droids that just kept running long after the civilization that built them had turned to dust. And the scariest part is that most of the galaxy never even knew it was there. For thousands of years, the pattern had been the same. The Rakata would show up at a new world, take what they wanted, and add another planet to their empire. Nobody had been able to stop them. Nobody had even come close. But around 27,700 BBY, the Infinite Empire discovered a planet called Korriban. And on Korriban, they ran into something they had never encountered before. A species that fought back and won. The Sith species lived on Korriban, and they were not like the other civilizations the Rakata had rolled over. The Sith were powerful Force users in their own right. They were aggressive. They were proud. And they were led by a figure named King Adas. a towering Sith Lord who had unified the fractious Sith people under a single rule. Ardus had been around for centuries at this point. He was near immortal, and he had spent that time bringing together a species that had spent most of its history fighting itself. By the time the Rakata arrived, the Sith were united, and they had a leader who knew exactly what he was doing. The Rakata did not come in swinging. They tried something different with the Sith. They approached Korriban with apparent friendliness. They offered gifts, and the biggest gift they shared was the technology behind holocrons. Holocrons were devices capable of storing enormous amounts of information, including the consciousness of Force users themselves. The Rakata handed this technology over to the Sith as if it were a gesture of goodwill, as if they were just two civilizations meeting for the first time and exchanging knowledge. But King Ardus was far sharper than the Rakata expected. He watched the way they operated. He studied their behavior, and he figured out very quickly what their real intentions were. This was the same playbook the Rakata had used on hundreds of other worlds. Show up with a smile, offer something valuable, get your foot in the door, and then take everything. Conquest and subjugation dressed up as diplomacy. Ardus saw right through it, and instead of waiting for the trap to close, Ardus moved first. He rallied the Sith people and launched a full-scale revolt against the Rakatan forces on Korriban. The fighting was fierce. The Sith threw everything they had at the Rakata, and the Rakata pushed back with the full weight of their military technology. But Korriban was Sith territory. The Sith knew their world. They knew how to fight on it. And they had a leader who refused to give an inch. The Sith drove the Rakata off Korriban entirely. For the first time in the history of the Infinite Empire, a species had told them no and made it stick. But the victory came at a cost that the Sith would feel for generations. King Ardus fell in the final battle. The leader who had seemed untouchable for centuries, the one figure who had managed to hold the entire Sith species together, was gone, and without him, the unity he had built collapsed almost immediately. The Sith fractured back into competing factions and fell into a prolonged period of internal fighting that would last for a very long time. Ardus had saved his people from the Rakata, but his absence left a hole that nobody could fill. There is one detail from this encounter that ended up echoing across the next 28,000 years of galactic history. The Sith kept the holocrons, the technology that the Rakata had shared as bait, the gift that was supposed to soften the Sith up before the real conquest began, stayed on Korriban after the Rakata were driven out. And the Sith did not just keep it. They made it central to their entire culture. Holocrons became the primary way that Sith Lords passed down their knowledge, their teachings, and in some cases their very consciousness to future generations. Every Sith holocron that shows up in Star Wars, from the Old Republic era all the way through the reign of the Empire, traces its origin back to this moment. The Rakata lost the battle for Korriban, but the one thing they left behind shaped the Sith forever. Now, while Korriban was the one world that fought the Rakata off, the rest of the galaxy was not so fortunate. During this same era, the Rakata were pushing deeper into the region that would later become the core worlds. They had already taken Coruscant. They had already taken Corellia, and the list of species living under their control continued to grow. The Rakata left physical marks on every world they touched. They built temples on their conquered planets, structures that served as both symbols of their authority and functional centers for their operations. And those temples were built to last. Rakatan temples could still be found standing on worlds like Honogur as late as the Clone Wars, tens of thousands of years after the empire that built them had ceased to exist. The galaxy was littered with their architecture, and most of the people who later walked past those structures had no idea who had put them there or what they represented. Some remnants of the Rakata's presence survived in unexpected ways. In the Tion cluster, Rakatan cast-offs, leftover fragments of their technology and their presence, persisted as late as 25,100 BBY. Tionese humans in that region managed to get their hands on this leftover Force-sensitive technology and used it to advance their own civilization. They were building on top of scraps that the Rakata had left behind without ever fully understanding where those scraps came from. And this leads to something that most Star Wars fans do not realize. The basic technologies that would eventually form the backbone of galactic civilization all trace back to the Rakata. The conceptual foundation for the hyperdrive, the technology that would make the Galactic Republic possible, that would allow trade routes to connect thousands of systems, that would enable everything from the Clone Wars to the Rebellion started with Rakatan engineering. And behind that, it may have started with the Celestials themselves. Every ship that ever jumped to light speed in the Star Wars galaxy was using technology that had its roots in an empire built on the dark side of the Force. The Rakata shaped the galaxy in ways that went far beyond their own lifetime. They built the tools that everyone who came after them would use, and nobody ever gave them credit for it. Because by the time those tools became standard, nobody remembered who the builders were. Now we need to rewind the timeline for a moment. Because thousands of years before the Rakata reached the height of their power, something happened on the other side of the galaxy that would eventually come back to challenge them in a way they never saw coming. In 36,453 BBY, a collection of mysterious ships called the Thoyor appeared across the galaxy. Nobody knew where they came from. Nobody knew who built them. But the Thoyor sought out Force-sensitive beings on dozens of different worlds and carried them to a single destination, a planet called Tython, tucked deep inside the region known as the Deep Core. On Tython, these Force-sensitives from all over the galaxy came together and discovered the Force. They studied it, they learned to channel it, and they founded an order called the Jedi. These were the predecessors of the Jedi. But the Jedi were different from the Jedi in one very important way. They did not follow the light side alone. They pursued balance between both sides of the Force. They called the light side Ashla and the dark side Bogan, naming them after the two moons that hung in the sky above Tython. And Tython itself enforced that balance. The planet reacted to shifts in the Force. If the balance between light and dark tipped too far in either direction, massive Force storms would tear across the surface. Tython did not tolerate imbalance. It punished it. The planet also held a secret buried deep underground. Inside a massive chasm called the Abyss, there was a prime infinity gate, one of the ancient quad devices that allowed instantaneous travel across the galaxy. The same technology the Qua had fought so hard to keep out of Rakatan hands. And it had been sitting on Tython, hidden and forgotten for thousands of years. Now fast forward to 25,793 BBY. The Infinite Empire was still the dominant power in the galaxy. But something was wrong. The Rakata were beginning to notice that their connection to the Force was weakening. It was a slow decline, not a sudden collapse. But it was real. And for a civilization that ran every piece of its technology on the Force, Even a gradual loss was a serious problem. The High Praetor of the Infinite Empire at this time was a figure named Skalnas. And Skalnas had heard rumors of a world in the deep core that was strong with the Force. He believed that if he could find that world and access whatever was on it, he might be able to reverse the decline that was eating away at his species. He needed someone to find a path to this planet. And the person he turned to was a Force Hound named Zesh. Zesh was one of the most skilled Force Hounds in the entire Empire. He had been branded with the Arabesh letter for his name across his face, his back, and his arms. He had never known anything outside of servitude and the dark side. That was his entire world. Zesh had a broodmate named Trill. When they were young, Trill had looked out for him. She had protected him. But as adults, the Rakata forced them to fight each other. Zesh won. But instead of letting Trill be discarded, he talked his master, Praetor Tulkar, into giving Trill to the higher-ranking Skalnas as a gift. It saved her life. But Trill never saw it that way. She saw it as the worst kind of betrayal. Trill had already been sent to find the Force-strong world in the deep core, but she had failed. So Skalnas requested Zesh for the job. Zesh succeeded where Trill could not. He found a path through the deep core to Tython, but the journey did not go smoothly. Tulkar's warship, the Devourer, was destroyed over Tython. Zesh was the only one who survived. He crashed on the surface of the planet and found himself stranded on a world unlike anything he had ever experienced. 3 young Jedi journeyers were waiting for him. Shea Koda, Seknos Wrath, and Tasha Rio had all received Force visions of his arrival before he even landed. They found Zesh and confronted him, not knowing what to make of this stranger who radiated the dark side. What none of them understood, and what Zesh himself did not know, was that Skalnas had placed hidden memory blocks inside his mind before the mission. Zesh was not just a castaway who had washed up on Tython by accident. He was an unwitting spy, a sleeper agent who could be activated at any moment. In 25,793 BBY, Skalnas launched his invasion. The Infinite Empire came to the Tython system in force. Rakatan warships devastated Fury Station on the edges of the system. They captured the gas giants Obri and Maw, and they deployed Flesh Raiders by the thousands. Flesh Raiders were mutated lower caste Rakata, who had been bred specifically as disposable soldiers. They were not there to think. They were there to overwhelm through sheer numbers. The Rakata were pushed back from Tython in their initial assault, but they were far from finished. They established a command post called Rakatan Base Prime on a forest world named Skargora and dug in for a longer campaign. Skalnas was not going to leave without the Infinity Gate. He believed it was his species' only chance at survival. The Jedi rallied. They allied with the forces of the settled worlds, the civilizations that existed across the Tython system, and Master Rajivari was placed in command of the defense. The Jedi also made a difficult choice during this war. They built Force Sabers. These were the dark side weapons of the Rakata, and using them meant drawing on the dark side of the Force. For an order that was built on balance, this was a dangerous compromise, but they were facing the most powerful military force in the galaxy, and they needed every advantage they could get. Then Skalnas played his hand. He activated the memory blocks in Zesh's mind. Everything Zesh had experienced on Tython, every connection he had formed with the Jedi, every moment of something that might have been freedom, was overwritten. His conditioning came flooding back. Zesh turned on his new friends and returned to Skalnas. But at the very end of the battle, something happened that Skalnas could not have predicted. Shea Koda found Zesh. And instead of fighting him, instead of trying to force him back to their side, she did something that cut through every layer of conditioning the Rakata had ever put on him. She forgave him. Completely and unconditionally, out of love. In that moment, Zesh broke free. He rejected the name the Rakata had branded on his body and reclaimed the name he had been born with, Tau. And Tau turned on Skalnas. He struck down the High Praetor in the Chasm of Tython, ending the architect of the entire invasion. At the same time, Tasha Rio made the ultimate sacrifice. She gave up her mortal form to awaken the Thoyor ships. The same mysterious vessels that had brought Force sensitives to Tython thousands of years earlier came alive and unleashed devastating beams of energy on the Rakatan fleet above the planet. With Skalnas gone, the Rakatan command structure fell apart instantly. The sub-Praetors turned on each other in a panic, each one scrambling for control instead of coordinating the fight. The settled world's fleet swept in and finished off the remaining Rakatan forces. The invasion of Tython was over, and the Rakata had lost. This was the second time a civilization had beaten the Infinite Empire in a straight fight. The Sith had done it on Korriban, and now the Jedi had done it on Tython. The cracks in the Rakata's grip on the galaxy were getting wider, and the force that had made their entire civilization possible, their connection to the dark side, was still fading. The empire that called itself infinite was running out of time. We talked about the Star Forge and what it was doing to the Rakata back in Chapter 4. The feedback loop, the amplification of every dark impulse, the slow, invisible corruption that was eating away at the Empire from the inside. Well, by this point in the timeline, that corruption had reached a breaking point. After generations of galactic supremacy, the Infinite Empire was fracturing. The Star Forge had been feeding on the Rakata's dark side tendencies for thousands of years, and the cumulative effect was finally too much to contain. The Rakatan leadership was falling apart. Paranoia had become the baseline. Praetors were turning on each other. The warrior castes and the priest castes, two factions that had always existed in tension, were now in open conflict. Colony worlds were pushing back against the homeworld. Rival leaders were making power grabs at every level of the empire. The Rakata had always been aggressive and self-serving, but the Star Forge had spent millennia cranking those traits up to a level that made cooperation impossible. The tool that had built the Infinite Empire was now tearing it apart. And then, around 25,200 BBY, something hit the Rakata that they never saw coming. A plague. It swept through their population at a terrifying speed, spreading from system to system across the entire empire. Billions of Rakata were wiped out. The disease was ruthless. But the most unsettling thing about it was the specificity. The plague only affected the Rakata. No other species in the galaxy caught it. Not a single one. Out of the hundreds of populations living under Rakatan control, covering thousands of worlds, only the Rakata themselves were getting sick. It was later theorized that the plague had been deliberately engineered by one of the captive species. A bioweapon designed from the ground up to target the Rakata and nobody else. And the reason it worked so well was something the Rakata had done to themselves. Over the centuries, the Rakata had maintained a high degree of genetic uniformity across their species. That uniformity made them efficient. It made them predictable in all the ways a military empire wants its population to be predictable. But it also made them the perfect target for a weapon that only needed to find one biological key to unlock the entire species. Whoever designed the plague, if it was designed at all, had found that key. But the plague did something worse than just taking lives. As it moved through the Rakatan population, a mysterious mutation in the disease began stripping the Rakata of their connection to the Force. One by one, across the Empire, Rakata, who had been Force-sensitive their entire lives, were losing that ability. The thing that had defined their species since before the Kwa arrived on Lehon, the trait that powered every piece of their technology and every aspect of their civilization, was being pulled out of them. Rakatan scientists scrambled. They developed theory after theory to explain what was happening. They tested every hypothesis they could come up with, and every single one of them was wrong. They had no answer. They had no cure. They had no way to stop it. The Force sensitivity that had been the foundation of everything the Rakata had ever built was being culled from their population at an accelerating rate, and they were completely helpless to do anything about it. Now think about what that meant in practical terms. Every hyperdrive in the Rakatan fleet was Force-powered. Every weapon system, every factory, every piece of infrastructure across 500 worlds, all of it required the Force to operate. And suddenly, the beings who were supposed to be operating all of it could not touch the Force anymore. It was like watching someone pull the power cable out of an entire civilization. The ships stopped working. The factories went silent. The weapons that had kept 1 trillion captives in line were now just dead machines that nobody could turn on. The captive populations across the galaxy noticed. Of course they did. For thousands of years, the Rakata had seemed untouchable. Their technology was beyond anything their subjects could match. Their Force abilities made them seem almost godlike. But now the gods were weakening. The fear that had held everything together was starting to crack. And once that fear cracked, there was nothing left to keep 1 trillion beings in line. The uprising started everywhere at once. Humans, Duros, Hergliks, Baragwins, Deveronians, Gossams, and countless others rose up against their Rakatan overlords. Across the entire empire, on world after world, the species that had been held down for thousands of years turned on the beings who had held them there. And the Rakata, ravaged by plague, stripped of the Force, unable to operate any of the machines that had made them powerful in the first place, could not fight back. They had nothing left. The Rakata abandoned their conquests. They pulled back from world after world, retreating across the galaxy toward the only place they had left. Lehon, their homeworld, the planet where everything had started. The infinite empire, which had ruled the galaxy for approximately 10,000 years, collapsed almost overnight. An empire that had linked 500 worlds, that had controlled 1 trillion beings, that had reshaped planets and consumed civilizations, was done, finished, pulled apart by a plague it could not cure, a corruption it could not see, and a galaxy full of people who had been waiting for exactly this moment. The Rakata came home to Lehon. They had abandoned every world they had ever conquered, pulled back across the galaxy, and retreated to the one planet they had left. And you might think that would be the moment where they came together, where the shared experience of losing everything forced them to set aside their differences and figure out how to survive. But that is not what happened. That is not what happened at all. The moment the Rakata were all back on Lehon, they started fighting each other. The factions that had been building tension for centuries, The cracks that the Star Forge had been widening for thousands of years, all of it finally broke wide open. The Rakata on Lahan split into two primary groups: the warrior caste on one side, the priest caste on the other. And the war between them was not a political struggle or a series of heated arguments. It was a full-scale conflict, fought with weapons that should never have been used on a homeworld. Warlords on both sides deployed weapons of mass destruction against each other. The blasts were so devastating that they destroyed every city on the surface of Lahan. Every single one. The planet that had been the seat of a galactic empire, the world that had once been the center of everything the Rakata had built, was reduced to chains of isolated islands scattered across the ocean. The geography of the planet itself was rewritten by the fighting. Lahan before the war and Lahan after the war were two completely different places. The war nearly ended the Rakata as a species. They came that close to finishing themselves off. And during the worst of the fighting, multiple tribes made a desperate decision. They raided the storehouses of the Star Forge, which was still hanging in orbit above the planet. The station was inoperable without the Force, but the supplies and materials stored inside it were still there. These tribes grabbed whatever they could carry, and they fled Lahan entirely, escaping into the unknown regions ahead of what was shaping up to be a nuclear exchange between the warriors and the priests. These refugees scattered across a stretch of remote worlds that would later become known as the Rakatan Archipelago. They were running from their own species, carrying scraps of their former glory, trying to start over on worlds that nobody in the wider galaxy even knew existed. Back on Lahan, the aftermath of the Civil War left the planet in ruins, and the Rakata who survived split into two very different groups that would define the next 20,000 years of life on this world. The majority of the surviving Rakata were driven underground. They lost their technology. They lost their knowledge. They lost any connection to the civilization they had once been part of. Over time, they devolved into primitive tribal groups that lived in the caves and tunnels beneath the surface. They became savage. They became warlike, and they became known as the Black Rakata. Everything about the Infinite Empire, everything their ancestors had built and controlled, faded from their memory until all that was left was survival and aggression. Only one faction managed to hold on to some piece of what the Rakata had been. The descendants of the priest caste stayed on the surface, protected by their ancient temple enclaves. They called themselves the Elders, and the Elders took on a responsibility that they would carry for the rest of their existence. They gathered up the knowledge of the Infinite Empire's most dangerous technology, and they locked it away inside a structure called the Temple of the Ancients. Their goal was to make sure that none of it could ever be used again. They had watched what the dark side and unchecked power had done to their species. They had watched the Star Forge eat their civilization alive, and they decided that the only thing left to do was stand guard over the wreckage and make sure nobody else made the same mistakes. The Black Rakata eventually returned to the surface over the millennia. They were led by a chief who called himself the One, and they were everything the Elders were not. Aggressive, territorial, dangerous. They constantly threatened the Elder enclaves, and the tension between the two groups became the defining feature of life on Lahan for thousands and thousands of years. Two remnants of the same species, living on the same ruined planet, unable to coexist. And the Elders carried one specific regret that weighed on them more than anything else. The Star Forge was still up there. It was hanging in orbit above Lahan, dead and inoperable, but intact. The Elders wanted it gone. They wanted to destroy it once and for all, so they could finally close the book on what the Infinite Empire had been. But they could not. The Temple of the Ancients which held the controls and the knowledge needed to access the Star Forge, required the Force to enter. And the Rakata did not have the Force anymore. The plague had taken it from them. The one thing the Elders wanted to do more than anything else in the galaxy was something they were physically incapable of doing. They could see the Star Forge in the sky above them. They knew exactly what it was and what it represented, and they could not touch it. They were prisoners of their own history, trapped on a ruined planet with a reminder of their greatest failure hanging over their heads every single day. Meanwhile, out in the wider galaxy, something even more final was happening. The species that the Rakata had held captive for thousands of years were free now. They were building new governments. They were forming alliances. They were creating the foundations of what would become the Galactic Republic. And as they built their new civilizations, they did something very deliberate. They erased the Rakata from history. Nobody wanted to remember. Nobody wanted to look back at what had been done to them. The Rakata, who had once controlled 500 worlds and 1 trillion beings, were written out of the story. Their temples still stood on dozens of planets. Their ruins were scattered across the galaxy. But over the centuries, those structures became mysteries with no answers. Archaeological curiosities that nobody could explain. Researchers would find Rakatan ruins on some forgotten world and have no idea who had built them or why. The builders had become ghosts, and it would take over 20,000 years, all the way until the Jedi Civil War, before anyone in the galaxy would finally piece together the truth about who the Rakata were and what they had done. For over 20,000 years, the Rakata stayed forgotten. The galaxy moved on without them. The Republic grew. The Jedi Order expanded. Wars were fought and won and lost across thousands of systems. And through all of it, nobody knew that a dead empire was sitting in the unknown regions, waiting on a ruined planet with the most powerful factory ever built still hanging in orbit above them. Then, 2 Jedi found it, and everything changed. Around 3,960 BBY, the galaxy was in the middle of the Mandalorian Wars. The Mandalorians had been tearing through Republic space, and the Jedi Council refused to get involved. But 2 Jedi Knights decided they were not going to sit back and watch. Revan and Malak gathered a group of Jedi who shared their frustration, and they went to war. They led the Republic military against the Mandalorians, and they won. They defeated Mandalore the Ultimate and ended the threat. But after the victory, instead of coming home, Revan and Malak followed a trail. They had picked up traces of a mysterious Sith influence during the war, something pulling at the edges of the galaxy, and they chased it into the unknown regions. What they found out there was something nobody in the Republic knew existed, a reconstituted Sith Empire led by a figure known as the Sith Emperor. And the Sith Emperor did not fight Revan and Malak. He turned them. He reached into their minds and pulled them to the dark side. Both of them, 2 of the most capable Jedi of their generation, converted into agents of the Sith. The Emperor sent them back into the Republic with a mission: find the ancient Rakatan Star Forge. But something happened on the way back. Revan and Malak broke free of the Emperor's mental control. They shook off his influence and regained their own will. But they did not abandon the mission. They kept looking for the Star Forge, not because the Emperor told them to, but because they wanted it for themselves. They traveled across the galaxy, planet by planet, searching for the star maps. The ancient Rakatan navigational monuments that had been placed on conquered worlds tens of thousands of years earlier. The self-sustaining, self-repairing devices that still displayed the full extent of the infinite empire, with Lihon at the center. By 3959 BBY, Revan and Malak had located 4 star maps. And when they combined the data from all 4, the maps pointed to a single location, the Lehon system. When they arrived, the Rakatan disruptor field was still active. The same planetary defense system that had protected the Starforge for over 20,000 years reached out and grabbed their ship. Their systems failed. Their navigation went dark, and they crashed on the surface of Lehon. The 2 Dark Lords found themselves stranded on the homeworld of an empire they had never heard of, surrounded by the descendants of a species that the rest of the galaxy had completely forgotten. The Black Rakata found them first. Revan and Malak were captured and brought before the One, the chief of the savage tribal Rakata who lived on the surface. The Black Rakata had no idea what the Starforge was or what it could do. They had lost that knowledge generations ago. But Revan needed information, and he was not in the mood to negotiate. He used the Force to rip the Rakatan language directly out of the One's mind. Just tore it free so he could communicate. The One made Revan an offer. He would help Revan get into the Temple of the Ancients if Revan would destroy the Elder tribe in return. The Elders were the other surviving faction on Lehon, the descendants of the priest caste who had been guarding the temple and its forbidden knowledge for millennia. The One wanted them gone. Revan took the information but did not take the deal. Instead, he found the Elders on his own. And the Elders had been waiting for this moment for a very long time. They knew the Temple of the Ancients required the Force to enter. They knew they could not do it themselves. They had spent thousands of years hoping that someday someone with the Force would come to Lehon and help them finish what they had started. They wanted the Starforge destroyed. They wanted to close the final chapter of the Infinite Empire forever. And here was Revan standing in front of them, strong in the Force, offering to go inside. The Elders granted him access. They believed his promise that he would destroy the Starforge. Revan lied. He entered the Temple of the Ancients, gained access to the orbital systems, and claimed the Starforge as his own. The factory that had been sitting dormant above the Rakatan sun for over 20,000 years came back to life under the command of a fallen Jedi. And Revan used it for exactly what it was designed to do. He fed the Starforge the dark side energy it craved, and the station responded by producing warships at a pace the galaxy had not seen since the height of the Infinite Empire. Darth Revan built a massive military fleet and launched what became known as the Jedi Civil War against the Galactic Republic. The Starforge was back, and the galaxy was paying for it. But the story did not end there. Revan was betrayed by his own apprentice. Darth Malak turned on him, and the Jedi managed to capture Revan in the chaos. They wiped his mind. Every memory, every piece of who Darth Revan had been was erased. The Jedi gave him a new identity, retrained him in the ways of the light side, and sent him on a mission to find the star maps all over again. They needed to locate the Starforge so the Republic could destroy it. And Revan, now walking the same path he had walked before, but as a completely different person, succeeded. He found the star maps a second time, and a second time they led him to Lehon. Revan crashed on the planet again. The disruptor field caught his ship the same way it had caught it before, and once again he found himself standing between the Black Rakata and the Elders. But this time, Revan was not the same man. He was redeemed. He sided with the Elders, and he made things right. He fought through the Black Rakata, took down the One, and freed Elder prisoners that had been captured by the tribes. The elders granted him access to the Temple of the Ancients once more. And this time, Revan kept his word. He went inside and disabled the disruptor field from within the temple, opening the system up for the Republic fleet that was waiting outside. He also helped the Rakata in their efforts to regain their lost connection to the Force, something the elders had been trying to achieve for thousands of years. The Republic fleet jumped into the Lehon system and the Battle of Rakata Prime began. Revan boarded the Star Forge himself. He fought his way through the station to reach Darth Malak, the apprentice who had taken everything from him. And at the heart of the Star Forge, the factory that had been corrupting the Rakata since before the Republic existed, Revan defeated Malak. The Republic fleet opened fire on the station. The Star Forge, weakened and exposed, could not withstand the assault. It fell out of orbit, plunged into the Rakatan sun, and was consumed in a massive explosion. The most powerful weapon the Infinite Empire had ever built was finally gone. Over 20,000 years after the Rakata lost the ability to use it, someone else had come along, turned it back on, and then a second someone had come along and finished it off for good. The Jedi Civil War was over. The Republic held a celebration at the Temple of the Ancients on Lehon, standing in the same halls where the Rakata had once locked away the secrets of their empire. Revan was awarded the Cross of Glory for his role in ending the war and destroying the Star Forge. And the elders, after all those millennia of watching and waiting, finally got what they had always wanted. The Star Forge was gone from their sky. The Star Forge was gone. The Jedi Civil War was over. And for the first time in over 20,000 years, the galaxy knew the Rakata existed. But knowing they existed and caring about them were two very different things. The Republic set up an outpost in the Lehon system after the war. They kept a presence there, watching the planet, monitoring what was left. But they did not invite the Rakata into the Republic. They did not offer them membership. They did not extend any of the benefits that came with being part of the galactic community. And honestly, most people in the Republic did not even believe the Rakata were who they said they were. The Lehon system itself was quarantined. The wreckage from the Battle of Rakata Prime, the remains of the Star Forge, the destroyed ships from both sides of the conflict, all of it was left exactly where it had fallen. Nobody cleaned it up. Nobody salvaged it. Over time, large pieces of metal from the debris fused together in orbit, forming a ring-like construct around the planet. Lehon sat there in the unknown regions, surrounded by the remnants of its own history, and the galaxy slowly stopped paying attention. Some of the surviving Rakata left Lehon after the Jedi Civil War, scattering to other worlds. The ones who stayed behind watched their population continue to shrink. The species was fading, and there was nothing anyone could do to stop it. But the Rakata's legacy was not done surfacing. Centuries later, around 3641 BBY, the galaxy was caught up in another massive conflict, the Galactic War between the Republic and the Sith Empire. And during that war, Rakatan ghosts started crawling out of the ground on multiple worlds at the same time. On Tatooine, the desert world that the Rakata had turned to glass tens of thousands of years earlier, another piece of their past turned up. An Imperial Reclamation Service team stumbled onto a Chirka Corporation archaeological dig that had recovered a Rakatan mine trap. Inside that mine trap was the consciousness of a Rakata who called himself the Imprisoned One. He had been sitting in that virtual white room for thousands of years, fully aware, fully conscious, waiting. And the Imprisoned One had plans. He wanted to bring the Infinite Empire back. He wanted to restore Rakatan dominance over the galaxy. A being from a civilization that had been gone for 20 millennia, still plotting a comeback from inside a prison the size of a small device. He was ultimately stopped, but the fact that he was still in there, still thinking, still scheming after all that time, tells you something about the kind of species the Rakata were. And then there was Revan. The man who had found the Star Forge, lost himself to it, been redeemed, and then destroyed it. Revan came back to Lehon in 3637 BBY during the Galactic War. He set up a base at the Temple of the Ancients with a group of fanatical followers and tried to build an army to fight the Sith. His lieutenants were taken down by a combined Republic and Sith strike team. Separately, Revan also seized control of the Foundry, a Rakatan space station, and attempted to construct an army of droids programmed to target anyone carrying Sith DNA. An Imperial strike team put an end to that plan as well. Even decades after the Jedi Civil War, Revan was still tangled up with Rakatan technology. The builders had been gone for 20,000 years, and their creations were still shaping the course of galactic events. Now here is a part of the Rakata story that most fans have never heard of. Remember those tribes that fled Lehon during the Civil War? The ones who raided the Star Forge's storehouses and escaped into the unknown regions. They survived. They settled a scattered chain of worlds that became known as the Rakatan Archipelago. And the archipelago was a strange and disturbing place. No Republic surveyor ever found it. The major powers of the unknown regions were largely unaware it existed. It was a pocket of Rakatan civilization hiding in the gaps of the galaxy, completely cut off from everything. And what the Rakata built there varied wildly from world to world. On the more primitive planets, like Fitomp and Hilak, the Rakata tribes had lost so much knowledge that they believed their single planet was the entirety of creation. They fought wars against other native species with no understanding of the wider galaxy around them. On more advanced worlds like Makatak and Tulpa, the priest and warrior classes had managed to hold on to some of their ancestors' technology. They wielded disruptor fields, builder droids, and skip ships. Two tribes had even started constructing small orbital factories about half a kilometer in size that functioned like miniature versions of the Star Forge. They were trying to rebuild what their ancestors had lost. But there was one thing that united every Rakata in the archipelago, regardless of how advanced or how primitive they were. They all wanted the Force back. Every single one of them. They described the loss of their Force connection as a black hole in their chests, an emptiness that never went away. Priest-caste scientists across the archipelago were running experiments on living beings, trying to figure out how to restore what the plague had taken from them. These experiments included vivisection of captives, cutting them open while they were still alive, trying to find where the Force lived inside a living body. And the captive species in the archipelago, including mutated Wookiees who had lost their fur and deformed Selkath, were still suffering under the same cruelty that had defined the Infinite Empire at its peak. Tens of thousands of years had passed. The galaxy had moved on. But in this forgotten corner of the unknown regions, the Rakata were still doing exactly what they had always done. Around 1000 BBY, a Sith Lord named Darth Bane came to Lehon. He was not there for the Rakata. He did not care about the Rakata. He was there because Darth Revan had left something behind on this planet nearly 3,000 years earlier. A Sith holocron. Bane had also studied a book that Revan had written, titled The Rakata and the Unknown World, which sat in the archives of the Sith Academy on Korriban. Between the holocron and the book, Bane had pieced together enough of the Rakata's story to understand what had happened on this world, and he wanted to see it for himself. When Bane landed on Lehon, there was nobody there. The planet was completely empty of sentient life. The Rakata on Lehon were gone, extinct. Their gene pool had been too small to sustain the species on an isolated world in the unknown regions. After tens of thousands of years, after everything they had built and everything they had destroyed, after the Empire and the Plague and the Civil War and the long, slow decline, the Rakata on their homeworld had run out. There were no more of them. The beaches were empty. The ruins stood in silence. The Temple of the Ancients was still there, but nobody was guarding it anymore. The elders who had spent millennia watching over the forbidden knowledge of their ancestors were gone. The Black Rakata who had threatened them from the shadows for just as long were gone too. Lehon was a graveyard, but the planet still carried something. Bane could feel it the moment he arrived. The dark side of the Force saturated Lehon. It soaked through the ground, the air, every surface. Bane, who had walked the tombs of Korriban, who had stood in the most concentrated nexus of dark side energy the Sith had ever known, felt that Lehon was even stronger. Tens of thousands of years of dark side usage had left a mark on this world that nothing could erase. The Rakata were gone, but the darkness they had fed for millennia was still there, pressed into the fabric of the planet like a stain that would never come out. Bane found what he came for. He studied Revan's holocron inside the Temple of the Ancients and absorbed everything it contained. And what Bane took from Lehon shaped the future of the Sith for the next 1,000 years. Because the Rakata's story taught him something specific. The Infinite Empire had destroyed itself through infighting. The dark side had amplified their worst tendencies until they turned on each other. Too many Sith, too much ambition, too many hands reaching for the same throne. That was what had brought the Rakata down from the inside. And Bane recognized that the Sith of his own era were making the exact same mistake. The Brotherhood of Darkness, the Sith Order that Bane belonged to, was tearing itself apart through the same kind of internal competition that had shattered the Infinite Empire. So Bane did something about it. He destroyed the Brotherhood of Darkness entirely. And from the ashes, he created the rule of two. One master, one apprentice, no more. The idea was simple. If the dark side's greatest weakness was that it turned its followers against each other, then you limit the number of followers. Two Sith, working in the shadows, passing their knowledge down one generation at a time. That was the system that would eventually produce Darth Sidious and Darth Vader. That was the system that brought down the Galactic Republic and the Jedi Order. And it was born on Lehon, in the ruins of a species that had learned the cost of the dark side the hard way. Before Bane left the planet, one more piece of the Rakata's legacy was lost. Bane fought his former master Qasim inside the Temple of the Ancients. During the duel, Bane collapsed one of the temple's major archways, destroying a section of the structure that had stood for over 20,000 years. The building that the elders had given their lives to protect, the last standing monument to the Infinite Empire on its homeworld, was crumbling, and there was nobody left who cared. A team of anthropologists eventually made the trip to Lehon and confirmed what Bane had already seen. The Rakata on this world had perished. The species that had once commanded 500 worlds was gone from the planet where it had started. The wider galaxy barely noticed. The Republic and the Jedi had done such a thorough job of suppressing Rakatan history that Lehon was treated as a footnote. A curiosity, a remote world in the unknown regions with some old ruins on its beaches. By the time the Galactic Empire rose to power thousands of years later, Lehon was long abandoned. Waves rolled over empty shores. Ruins lined the coastline, half buried in sand and salt. Silent monuments to a civilization that most people in the galaxy did not even know had existed. Thousands of years after the Infinite Empire collapsed, the Sith Lord Darth Plagueis gathered what remained of the Rakata's ancient history. He studied it carefully, and he told his apprentice, a young man named Palpatine, that the Rakata had done something remarkable. They had made the Force obey them. They had bent the most powerful energy in the galaxy to serve their purposes, and for a very long time, nobody had called them to account for it. Plagueis was fascinated by that idea, and the empire that his apprentice would eventually build carried echoes of the Infinite Empire that were impossible to ignore. Palpatine's Galactic Empire was built on the supremacy of one species over all others. It enforced order through overwhelming military force. It constructed superweapons capable of destroying entire planets. Palpatine even used the planet Biss as a dark side throne world, the same planet the Rakata had once claimed for themselves. The parallels between the two empires stretched across 30,000 years of history. The galaxy had forgotten the Rakata, but it kept repeating their mistakes. And that is the real story of the Rakata. Not just the conquests, not just the technology, not just the Star Forge or the prisons or the plague. The real story is what the dark side does to the people who think they can control it. The Rakata had everything. They had the Force running through every member of their species. They had technology that could reshape planets and produce endless fleets. They had 1 trillion beings under their control and 500 worlds at their command. They were the most powerful civilization the galaxy had ever seen, and the dark side ate all of it. The Star Forge amplified their worst instincts until they could not work together anymore. The plague stripped the Force from their bodies. The captive species they had held down for thousands of years rose up and swept them off every world they had ever taken. And the Rakata, the builders, the species that had once held the entire galaxy in their hands, retreated to one planet and spent their final centuries fighting each other in the ruins of everything they had lost. The most powerful empire in the history of Star Wars was not brought down by a rebellion. It was not brought down by a rival civilization. It was not brought down by any outside force at all. It was brought down by the same darkness that had built it in the first place. The Force they had bent to their will was taken from them. The station they had built to sustain their power consumed them instead. And in the end, on a quiet planet in the unknown regions, surrounded by ruins that nobody would ever visit, the builders could build nothing more.